Hello, everyone. My name is Weston Clay. I'm a psychotherapist at My Therapy NYC. If you're not familiar, My Therapy NYC is a group private practice in the Flatiron District of Manhattan in New York City. And today, this is a webinar called Feel Better. And in case you didn't get it, the title is a bit of a double entendre. In this webinar, you're going to gain some skills that will help you to feel your emotions in a more effective way. And when you can do that, you are more likely to feel mentally well as well. 2020 has been a year of a lot of emotions for so many of us, with the pandemic, the incidents of police brutality and racialized violence, all the protests, and now a Pride Month without a big celebration. There's a lot to have feelings about. So if you're going through a lot of emotions like so many of us, I hope this webinar will give you some new ways to ride those emotional waves and with some ease and confidence. So let's get started. If you're watching live, you'll see there is a poll question that's going to pop up here. And the poll question is, when you feel a strong emotion, what do you typically do? Your answers will be anonymous, and I'll give you some takeaways at the end, so stay tuned for that. But I'd love to see what you all have to say about that. You'll notice that there's a chat box, so if you want to leave any comments as we go, you're welcome to do that. And everyone that's participating can see that if you put something in the chat box. So just make sure you keep that in mind, that you're sharing with everyone here. And if you have any questions as we go, you can type those into the Q&A box. And those will only be seen by me, the presenter. And there will be a segment at the end where I'll be answering your questions for you. To keep the conversation going, you can join us on Twitter. You'll see our handle there is MyTherapyNYC. And we also are using a hashtag MyTherapyChat. So feel free to tweet and follow along with us as we have this webinar tonight. So again, the webinar is called Feel Better, Learn to Ride the Waves of Your Emotions, and it's presented by me, Weston Clay. And again, I'm a psychotherapist at My Therapy NYC. And here's what we're gonna be talking about tonight. So we're gonna start out with a little body scan, just to kind of get us started on how to think about how we can feel our emotions. And then we're going to answer some questions. What are emotions? Why should you feel your feelings? How do you feel your feelings? That's an important one, right? And then we're going to do a guided visualization where we're kind of putting some of these skills that we're talking about tonight into practice. And then we'll do poll question takeaways and finally a Q&A. And again, if you have a question that you want to ask me during the webinar, feel free to go ahead and send it in, but I won't be addressing questions until the end. So let's start out with a body scan. This is optional. If you feel like you are not in a place where you want to do this, that's okay. You can just kind of hang out. But if you feel comfortable doing so, maybe just kind of close your eyes and take a moment to turn inward. Take some deep breaths and just notice what's happening for you right now. You're not trying to change it. You're not trying to judge it. You're just noticing. Okay, so scan your body head to toe and notice any sensations that you might have. Tightness, tingling, anything like that. And if you encounter any sensations, ask yourself, what might this be signaling to me? Might it be connected to an emotion? And if you notice anything, just stay there for a second and take a deep breath, and then keep moving. And I'll give you just a few breaths here to kind of move through your body and see what you find. Next, I want you to ask yourself, what is my emotional state right now? What am I coming into this webinar with? And how can you tell that? And then when you're ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes and come back to our virtual room here. So I wanted to start this webinar with a body scan for a couple of reasons. The first is we've already touched on a couple of the skills that we're going to be introducing in this webinar. Noticing emotions and the body sensations that come up with them is a really foundational skill for how we're going to ride those waves. Our bodies are amazing tools for noticing and working with our emotions. So let's get going. Where do we go wrong with feeling? I think this is a good place to start. So as a therapist, I often see people coming into therapy in one of two camps of how they deal with their emotions. And sometimes I'll ask people this early on in treatment. How do you deal with your emotions? And I notice that there are two often kind of unhealthy or unhelpful ways. One is what I would call suppression, or pushing the emotions down, not wanting to deal with them. And the other is flooding, so feeling like the emotions just take over and there's not much of a choice in the matter. And I've noticed as a therapist when I work with clients that a lot of times this is connected to early messaging in people's families related to emotions. So for instance, I have one client whose parents responded to his emotions by saying things like, get over it, let it go, or man up. And you can guess, as an adult, he tends to be in the suppression camp. I have another client who learned he could get what he wanted by showing emotions in a really big way when he was a kid. He would throw fits and have tantrums and eventually get what he wanted. But now as an adult, he struggles with this because when he has these big displays of emotion, which he actually doesn't really feel like he can control, then people tend to turn away from him. And he has lost some important relationships in his life over this. So there's a downside to both of these styles of dealing with your emotions. With emotional suppression, we don't really have the opportunities to get support, right? Because we don't talk about our emotions. We also don't get the relief that comes through emotional experiencing and expression, which is what this webinar is all about. And we may feel shame about our emotions, right? Because we're kind of trying to push them down. There's something that we don't feel proud about. And then with emotional flooding, we also don't feel in control of ourselves, right? That's the downside here, is it feels very out of control. And as was the case for my client, a lot of times people will turn away from us when we have emotions that just kind of take over unexpectedly. And in a similar way, we may feel shame about our emotions because they cause us problems, right? Well, let's talk about 3 common myths about emotions before we get into it a little bit more. The first one is if you feel an emotion, it will get bigger and bigger. The second common myth is that if you can't control your emotions, you are weak. And the third common myth is some emotions are dangerous or bad. So for example, anger. These are things I often hear from clients when they're coming in for therapy, that they believe one or more of these myths. So let's talk about what emotions are a little bit, and then we'll come back to those myths and talk about what the truth is around each of those. So one question, of course, is why do we have emotions? Well, the answer to this is really involved in where we are kind of evolved to as humans. So the first reason we have emotions is they're signals for survival. So a couple of examples of this. Anger, right, is an emotion that kicks us into fighting mode. It teaches us to fight or prompts us to fight for something. Or fear gets us to run away from danger. So both of these emotions are kind of helping us to survive in some way. Emotions help us to identify our needs and get them met. And this is actually connected to the first point, that emotions are signals for survival. Because the way that we're wired is that we rely on other people for safety. And this is less true than it was at the point in time that we kind of evolved our emotional systems. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But a lot of times our emotions are trying to keep us connected to other people. So an example of this would be sadness, or especially grief, right? If we lose someone really important to us, we grieve. And grief prompts us to seek comfort from others. And so this is a way that we can kind of stay connected to other people. And also, if we were in a dangerous place, we would be protected at this time of suffering when we're kind of distracted and maybe feeling weaker, because we would be aligning us with other people. And the last point is that emotions keep us connected. So something like joy, right? When we experience joy, it makes us want to share it with other people. So all these 3 points are really connected ultimately to emotions being a survival thing. So why then are emotions so confusing? And this is a question I get from clients a lot too. So the first reason is that we no longer depend on our immediate social circle for survival. So as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, our emotional systems are developed to a point where we really relied on other people in life or death situations. We needed other people to help us get food, to get shelter. That's not so much the case anymore, right? We don't really rely on our friends and family in the same way to keep us safe in life or death ways all that often. But our emotional systems are designed in that sort of scenario. So disconnection from other people is not really life or death anymore, right? When we feel disconnected or like we're having a problem in a relationship, it's not necessarily something that's going to lead to a life or death situation, but it can feel that way. And that's because our emotional systems are developed to rely on other people for that kind of safety. Another reason that emotions are so confusing these days is because we communicate in ways that our emotional brain is not built for. So take, for example, texting, right? With texting, we don't get the nonverbal or tonal cues that we get with speech, right? And this is where a lot of emotional communication happens, in the way that we are holding our faces, our bodies, in the ways, the tone of our voice. And so when we don't get those cues, we might get really confused about the emotional content of someone's message. And I think all of us have experienced this, right, with texting. But this can be true of email, even of phone calls, right? Because we're not in person with the other person, getting a chance to kind of see how they're communicating to us non-verbally. And the other reason that emotions are so confusing is that we just don't learn how to experience or manage our emotions in effective ways. So that's exactly why you're probably here at this webinar. And hopefully you'll learn some things that will help you with this. So now I want to watch a short video. So this video features Hilary Jacobs Hendel. She is the author of one of my favorite therapy books called It's Not Always Depression. And she is a therapist trained in a modality called accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's AEDP for short. And this type of therapy is created by Diana Fosha, and it's definitely a favorite modality at My Therapy NYC. It's emotion-focused and experiential. And as you watch this video, I want you to notice how she talks about emotions, and notice how she introduces this thing called the change triangle. We're going to be talking about this later in the presentation. It's a really useful tool for working with emotions. And the other reason that I wanted to show this video to you is because I want you to see the person behind this tool. I'm a really big fan of hers, and so I'm happy to show you Hilary Jacobs Hendel. So let's watch a short video.
The change triangle is a tool to help you understand and make use of your emotions so you feel better, more alive, and more you. My name is Hilary Jacobs Hendel, and I'm a psychotherapist, an author, and speaker. The Change triangle is an academic concept that I learned about in my training and that I am popularizing so that everybody can learn the properties of emotions and how to use them to feel better. Emotions are hardwired programs that are in the middle of the brain. They are triggered without conscious control. We cannot stop emotions from happening. And once you know that, it's liberating. Most of us have been raised to avoid emotions. And in fact, the mantra in my family was, if you're feeling something, let's fix it. Emotions are ultimately good for us because we need them to know how to live. They're a compass for living. If we can't feel sadness over loss, we really don't feel love. If we don't feel angry, we don't know if somebody has hurt us or violated our boundaries. As a therapist, implementing the change triangle has created virtually in 100% of the people that I work with change and transformation. From the day that I learned about the change triangle, I became obsessed with sharing it with people that I care about. I didn't really understand, why should only therapists be learning this information? It's a public health tool. It's a public health issue that people need to learn about emotions. I hope that everybody that wants to learn about emotions will have access to my blog, to my articles, to my book, to speaking engagements, that we can really reach everybody across the globe and help people feel better.
That's Hillary Jacobs Hendel. And just a couple things I want to notice about how she talks about emotions in that video. She talks about how they're hardwired, right? And that's something we kind of touched on earlier. And also that we can't control our emotions. The myths. Let's talk about these myths again. So the first myth is that if you feel an emotion, it will get bigger and bigger. Now, the truth is that core emotional experiences, and we'll talk more about what a core emotion is, they're more like waves that increase in intensity and then break into a sense of calm. So have you ever had an experience of having like what we call a good cry, where you cry really hard and then you feel way better? That is an example of an emotional wave and a core emotional experience. We often talk about how grief comes in waves, right? I think that's something that I hear with grief a lot, but I don't necessarily hear it with other emotions. But it's true of all core emotions. And again, we'll talk about what those are later. The second myth, if you can't control your emotions, you are weak. Well, as Hillary mentioned, nobody can control having emotions. And actually experiencing and expressing your emotion takes a lot of courage, right? Because we live in a world that's often kind of hostile to that. And also it takes a lot of vulnerability to express emotions, right? You're kind of putting yourself out there. And so it's actually, to me, it takes a lot of strength instead of weakness to be an emotional person. And the third one, some emotions are dangerous or bad, for example, anger. Now, the truth is that a behavior can be dangerous, but feeling the emotion itself is never dangerous. So, for example, if you are angry and you hurt someone, then the behavior is dangerous, not the emotion. And this is exactly why it's important to learn how to ride the wave of your emotions, so you can find safe, healthy, effective ways that you don't feel ashamed of for responding to your feelings. So why should you feel your feelings? Well, I just gave you one good reason, but there's more. The first is that it builds confidence in ourselves, right? So when we can successfully ride these emotional waves, we gain kind of a sense of mastery over our emotions. We feel like we can handle them. We fear our emotions less. And we also know how to be with others' emotions, right? So if you can kind of handle your own emotions and you have an idea of how to ride those waves, you might be able to help other people with that too. And this goes into the second point, that it can help build trust in relationships. So when we can feel with others, we have a sense of emotional safety, right? If we have an emotional experience with someone else and they're really there for us, we feel safe with that person. And we also know who will be responsive to our needs. So that's a really important thing for building trust in relationships. And it also helps us to protect our mental well-being. So when we're able to process our emotions, it helps our mental health. And two of the most common mental health issues, anxiety and depression, are both related to stuck emotions. So when we don't feel our feelings, we're really putting ourselves at risk for developing these problems and other ones, because anxiety and depression are kind of beneath a lot of other mental health issues that we might have. So we're going to talk about anxiety when we talk about Hillary's change triangle. But a quick word about depression while we're here. When we push our emotions down continually, we tend to end up in this kind of dull but unsatisfied place, and that's what depression is. So feeling your feelings can help you to prevent depression, really, to not go there, because you're letting yourself process those emotions and they're not just kind of getting stuck in you. So now let's talk about how you can feel your feelings. So to start, I want to give you a few foundational skills, 3 of them to be exact. And these skills, I think, are really important to help you when you are having these emotional experiences, to be able to access them and move through them in a way that feels safe. So these 3 skills kind of feed into how you're going to access and ride those waves of emotion. Now, the first foundational skill is self-compassion. And self-compassion is sort of like the opposite of self-criticism. So it's, instead of being hard on yourself or being mean to yourself, it's being really kind and compassionate with yourself. And the basic belief underlying this is that you're doing your best. Whatever's happening, kind of reminding yourself that you're doing your best. And something you can say to yourself that's very self-compassionate is the phrase, "We all struggle sometimes." So if you're having an emotional experience, being able to say, "You know what? We all struggle sometimes, and that's happening for me right now," can be a really self-compassionate way to help you to move through that emotional experience in a way that doesn't feel shameful. The second foundational skill is self-validation. Now, validation is really important when it comes to emotions. When people invalidate our emotions, it can be really damaging. And that is true for ourselves. When we do that to ourselves, it can also be really harmful. So self-validation is when we approach our emotions with the belief that they make sense. And a phrase that we can say to ourselves that's really emotionally self-validating is, "There's a reason I feel this way." Because if you kind of approach your emotion thinking, well, there's a reason that I'm feeling this way, then you also are less likely to feel shame about that emotion. And then the third foundational skill is grounding. So we've all had the experience of an emotion getting to feel too much, like it's just too much to handle. And usually this is when we're kind of feeling a little bit what we would call hyper aroused, we're kind of in fight or flight, there's like too much going on and it just doesn't feel safe. So grounding is a skill that we can use in those moments to kind of bring ourselves back down to a calm place while we're experiencing the emotion. So there are a few ways you can do this. One is just connecting to your breath and breathing deeply. Another is focusing on your senses. And I really like this one. So if you have something like a blanket that has a nice texture to it, or if you like essential oils that you can smell, or anything like that, you can kind of really put your focus into your senses. So really put your focus into how that blanket feels on your fingers. And really that can help to kind of get us out of the real kind of in our head place that we go when we're in that sort of anxiety place. And then the last one is connecting to gravity or the earth. So there's a few ways you can do this. You can just kind of feel the ground beneath your feet or the chair beneath your butt. You can lay on the ground and really just feel supported by the earth. And I know for me, just kind of breathing and like thinking about the fact that it's earth that's supporting me, the planet, and feeling gravity on my body can really help me to feel safe and soothed. So that's another way that you can ground. So here's the change triangle. And again, this is a concept that was developed by Hillary Jacobs Hendel. And I think it's an amazing graphic to help you work with your emotions. And Hillary popularized this. It's originally a concept from ADP therapy. And I want to say that Hillary very generously gave us explicit permission to use this triangle as well. So thank you so much, Hillary, if you see this. So let me walk you through it. Up at the top of the triangle here, we have defenses and inhibitory emotions. Our goal is to find a way down to the bottom of the triangle, which is core emotions. Now, there's a reason that it's a triangle, because if you can imagine putting the triangle on your torso, it's sort of, our core emotions tend to exist kind of really in our abdomen. And so this is sort of like imitating how that fits onto our body. So starting with defenses, this is anything that we do to avoid feeling. And there are all kinds of defenses. Just clear avoidance is a defense. So something like making a joke or changing the subject, or when something uncomfortable at home is happening, diving into your work. Those are all defenses, right? You're kind of trying to stay away from the uncomfortable feeling. Another type of defense is a numbing one. So having a drink, taking a pill, watching TV or scrolling Instagram. If you do any of those things in response to a negative feeling, then it's a defense, right? And I don't want to stigmatize taking pills. I mean, there are a lot of pills that really help people in moments where they're, having panic attacks or anxiety. So, that's totally okay. But there are ways that we can sometimes abuse those too to stay away from our emotional experience. And another type of defense is defensive language. So this is when we like criticize someone, or we refuse to take responsibility, or racist or prejudiced remarks are often also a defensive form of language. Over here, we have inhibitory emotions. So while defenses are things that we do to avoid feeling, inhibitory emotions are kind of emotions that we feel. We're still feeling something, but it's not the core emotion. It's something we tend to go to when we're kind of uncomfortable with the core emotion, but we're still having a feeling. And the three inhibitory emotions are anxiety, guilt, and shame. So anxiety, I often think of as being kind of in emotional purgatory. It's a place where we're feeling emotions, but we're kind of stuck in this like static, like emotional place. It doesn't really go anywhere, right? So that's anxiety. And then with guilt and shame, this is when we tend to blame ourselves or feel that we are flawed or bad in some way. And so guilt and shame can help us to stay connected to other people, right? If we kind of take the fall for something, then sometimes it preserves our relationships, but it's at the expense of our emotional well-being. So the real goal, if you find yourself in defenses or inhibitory emotions, is to try to find your way down to the core emotions. The core emotions are the survival and connection-based emotions that are wired into our emotional systems that we were talking about earlier. They often are linked to sensations or like energy in the body. And unlike defenses and inhibitory emotions, they can be transformative if we let ourselves feel them. So think about grief as an example of this. If we lose someone close to us in our lives, if someone passes away, and we don't turn into that grief, we turn away from it, we stay away from those feelings, we're probably going to get pretty depressed, right? It's just going to kind of, like I said, turn into that dull, depressed place. But if we let ourselves cry and feel that pain and feel those waves of emotion, we tend to get to a place where we feel really resolved about that loss. And so when we ride our emotional waves, this is where that happens, and it's a transformative experience. So the core emotions is where you're going to find that wave. Actually, and then there's one other place here, the open-hearted state or authentic self. This is where we tend to get to after we've experienced a core emotion. So you see the core emotions bring us down to this place. And this is where we really feel ourselves at our best and truest form. And we tend to get here when we ride the core emotional wave and then it breaks. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So if you're having trouble keeping up at all, I'm going to break down how we go through those emotional waves in just a second, and I'm also going to give an example. But this open-hearted state or authentic self place, you can see those words: calm, curious, connected, compassionate, confident, courageous, clear. If you've ever had that good cry and you end up feeling really kind of satisfied on the other end, this is where you are. And this is actually a really good place to make decisions about how to handle a situation that's been very emotional for you, because you're feeling really grounded, right? And you're feeling clear and you're feeling like you can take risks. And it's also a place of non-defensive responses, right? You're going to be open to listening and speaking in a way that you wouldn't if you were up in your defenses or in the inhibitory emotions. So getting to this open-hearted state is it's like the reward of going through all this. So let's talk about how you do this. How do you ride that wave? Well, the first step is to get in touch with the core emotion. So you might want to ask yourself, am I in my defense or am I experiencing an inhibitory emotion? What's going on for me? What corner of the triangle am I on right now? And if you find yourself in a defense, you want to kind of move it aside. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can use one of our foundational skills, self-compassion or self-validation, to work with the defense. So a sentence you might be able to say to yourself is something like, there must be a good reason that I get uncomfortable, and insert your defense here. Have a drink, change the subject, dive into work, whatever it is for you, right? Validating, there's a good reason why I do that, can be a good place for you to begin to understand what is that emotion underneath it and why am I uncomfortable going there. If you find yourself in anxiety, you want to regulate that anxiety. And one way you can do that is grounding. So if you find that you're having a really anxious experience, sitting and breathing for a while before you kind of try to ask yourself what core emotion might be beneath that anxiety can be a good way to get there. And if you're experiencing guilt or shame, if you're blaming yourself or you feel like there's something wrong with you, this is another place to use self-compassion and self-validation. These are great skills. So saying something to yourself, like if you're feeling guilty, well, there's got to be a good reason why I did what I did. I was having a hard time and it makes sense that I responded the way I did. So if you feel bad about the way that you responded to something, going ahead and giving yourself the benefit of the doubt, right? Like validating, there was a good reason why I did that. I was uncomfortable. And again, just like with the defense, that discomfort is probably an entryway to that core emotion. So another entryway to the core emotions is what I call somatic markers. So these are things that you're feeling in your body. So if the defenses or inhibitory emotions aren't really ringing a bell with you, or if you've already kind of worked through those and you're still not sure, ask yourself, do a little body scan, just like we did at the beginning of this webinar. Check in with yourself and notice if you have any body sensations that seem to be connected to an emotion. So some examples: clenched fist. That's a classic one for anger, but it might mean something else too. Tightness in your chest. A lump in your throat. It's a classic one for grief or sadness. A rushing sensation in your head can also be something linked to something like anger. So if you notice that when you think about a situation that's really emotional for you, that there's a strong bodily reaction, that's a great entryway to getting in touch with the core emotion. So step 2 is riding that wave. So this is where we ride the wave. So what you want to do is stay with the core emotion. I like to think about it as like giving it a lot of space. So you're probably going to want to make sure that you're in a place where it makes sense for you to do this, right? So if you're in a situation where you're really angry and you're in relation to someone else, you might need to step away. Hey, I need to go take a walk around the block. I need to go take 10 minutes in my room. And just get into that core emotion and make space for it and stay with it. A lot of times when emotions are uncomfortable, we want to turn away from them. But the suggestion here is to stay with that core emotion. Name the emotion. So you might say something like, I'm feeling angry. Validate and accept the emotion for yourself. So say something like, it's okay that I'm feeling angry, or it makes sense that I'm feeling angry. And then notice the sensations without judgment. So if with your anger, you're clenching your fists, or you have this like tightness in your chest, or a rushing sensation in your head, just notice it, put your attention on it, and stay with it. And if you need to, you can use your imagination too. So I know this sometimes makes people a little bit uncomfortable, but you can imagine expressing that anger to the person that upset you, right? I'm not telling you to go out there and chew that person out, but what's it like to imagine doing that? Does that help you to really get in touch with the anger and ride the wave? And then if you stay with that emotion and you stay with those sensations, chances are after a little bit, usually it's like 1 minute to 90 seconds, you'll begin to feel that calm. And this is the reward, right? This is the place where you kind of want to stay as long as you can. And so in the open-hearted state, this is again that feeling of calm after the wave breaks. A lot of people call this something like catharsis, right? This feeling of like, I've kind of had a release, an emotional release, and I'm feeling better. And this is also a great place to have a clearer idea of how to address a situation. So this is a good place to make choices about how you're going to handle the situation that brought up this emotion for you. So that's how you ride the wave. Now let's do an example. Let me give you an example of a client that I have. So I have a client who recently told me that he had a conversation on the phone with his father that ended badly. So his father and him were talking about Black Lives Matter and police brutality and the protests, and him and his father were not on the same page with this. They were disagreeing, and they usually get along really well. But they started arguing with each other, and my client ended up hanging up the phone on his father. And he was telling me that he just could not understand how his father didn't support the protests, especially since he and his father are people of color. He just didn't get it. And his father had been reaching out to him, and he'd been avoiding his father ever since this moment. And he noticed as well that he'd been drinking a lot, right? So he kind of let me know that one of his responses to this fight with his father was drinking more alcohol. So going to the change triangle, we see that this client of mine was experiencing a couple of defenses, right? Avoidance, avoiding his father, not wanting to go there, and also drinking alcohol. Both of those are defenses. So I noticed that, right? And I asked him, well, if you didn't have that drink, if you didn't have a drink every night, what do you think would happen? And his answer was, well, I've tried and I get really anxious. And so, he's experiencing also this inhibitory emotion of anxiety. So I asked him, can you connect to that anxiety now? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, let's stay with that. Can you feel it? He said, yes. All right. So we did some breathing and some grounding together in that anxiety. And I asked him to let me know what came up for him, if he experienced if he experienced anything as he was regulating this anxiety. And he said he started to feel sad and he felt a lump in his throat. And I said, okay, stay with that. Let's just make a lot of space for that feeling. Notice that sensation in your throat and stay with that sadness. So here we are in the core emotion of sadness. And he started crying and telling me that he was just very sad that his father and him don't share the same values. And he cried for maybe a minute and a half. And after this, he started to calm down. And he said that he felt a lot better after crying and that he was feeling calmer. And at the end of the session, he said that he wanted to call his father and tell him how sad he is that they don't share the same values. And that's something he hadn't thought to do before. Before, he had been much more kind of talking about political points or kind of, they just were in a much more argumentative state in the previous conversation. He'd never thought to tell his father that it just made him really sad. So that's an example of how we can think about our own emotional experiences using the change triangle. You can notice if you're in defense or inhibitory emotions and try to work your way into a core emotional experience. And if you can get there, you're more likely to find a better way to address the situation. So that's one example. And it's maybe not enough to really totally get how this works. And I'm not going to be able to tell you everything about the change triangle in this webinar. But what I can do is recommend that you read Hilary Jacob Hendel's book, It's Not Always Depression. So because we can't really think our way out of our emotions, right? And these aren't skills that we're all taught in school or that we know automatically. In fact, we're often taught to move away from these skills. So this book gives more examples of people using the change triangle to work through their core emotions. And so I really recommend reading this book for more examples and to help integrate these concepts so that you can use them for yourself. I highly recommend it. And I want to say one more thing before we kind of go back to the poll and answer some questions. And this is making a point about co-regulation. So co-regulation is when other people help us to regulate our emotions just through their presence with us. So when we're in the presence of other people who create a safe relationship, then we often feel grounded by them. We feel that they hold space for us. We feel a sense of safety. So co-regulation is a really important thing. And if you've experienced trauma or any other kind of distressing events, or you're really afraid to go to your own emotions, then you might want to find a way to get some co-regulation. And therapy is a great way to do that. So if your emotions feel too big for you or you feel like you need a lot more, I really do recommend finding a therapist, especially one who works with trauma, who can help you with this. So needing help learning to navigate difficult emotional experiences is totally normal and can really help you to integrate these skills for yourself. So let's get back to the poll question. So the question is, when you feel a strong emotion, what do you typically do? And so the first one was call a friend and talk about it. It looks like 39% of you said that, and that's most of you. So how do I respond to that? Well, I think that that's great. It's great to use your social support. The only thing I would say is if you can't get a hold of a friend, what do you do, right? And you might want to work on some of your self-compassion and self-validation skills and riding those emotional waves on your own so that you don't have to rely on friends and you don't have to feel terrible if your friends aren't available, right? So again, it's great. Co-regulation is in effect when you're talking to a friend about your emotions. But the only thing I would add is maybe practice some of these things that you can do on your own too. So 20% of you said, find something to get my mind off of it. So distraction is a great emotion regulation technique, unless it becomes avoidance. So avoidance, again, is a defense, right? We're staying away from that core emotion. So sometimes if an emotion is really big and strong, we might want a little time before we deal with it. We might want to, watch a TV show or watch a movie or read a book or do something to distract ourselves. And that's okay, but I would just recommend to come back to the feeling and ride the wave at some point. And then it looks like 13% of you said, get angry at myself for not controlling it. So self-shaming around emotions is common, but it's not a very helpful response, as I've kind of mentioned earlier in this webinar. So try self-compassion and self-validation. And see if you can reach out to people who you think will understand and support you, because maybe you need some help kind of transforming that shame and feeling better about your own emotions. About 4% of you said that you act on the feeling without thinking about it. What I would recommend is slowing down. So this is a good time to ground or breathe. Try to create extra space between the feeling and the action. Because if you're able to make that space and experience that emotion, you're going to be able to maybe get to that open-hearted state, the place on the other side of the emotional wave, and be able to kind of deal with the emotion in a way that you feel better about. So deciding how to act after you have that emotional wave. And then rely on my self-care regimen. It looks like 24% of you said that. It's really good to take care of yourself. Self-care, I can't endorse it highly enough. I think it's so important, and not enough people have good self-care. So that's really great. But I would say just make sure you aren't avoiding the emotion. So sometimes meditation can be taking us out of the emotion. Any sort of self-care thing can be like trying to escape the emotion. Make sure that's what you're not doing. And self-care can also be making space to ride the wave. So I know for myself, if I'm having a really emotional day, a lot of times what I'll do is one of my favorite self-care things, which is take a hot bath. And while I'm in the bath, I will purposefully make space for my emotion. So I'll ask myself, well, what am I feeling today? Am I sad today? Can I make space for that sadness here in this bath? So you can really integrate these skills into your self-care as well. So now I want to do a quick guided visualization. You've gotten a lot of concepts here, but maybe you can experience a little bit of it for yourself. So this is kind of going back to, again, we did that body scan at the beginning. Similar thing. See if you can get yourself into a nice supportive posture. Sit in a way that feels comfortable but upright. If you're comfortable, close your eyes or just turn inward. Begin to connect to your breath. Let's just slow down. You just took in a lot of information. Just check in. Now I want you to think about an experience that brought up a small amount of an emotional distress this week. So if we're talking about a scale of 1 to 10, of like 1 being totally calm, 10 being as distressed as you can imagine, somewhere in maybe the 2 to 4 range, nothing too intense. And just visualize the most potent moment of that situation, the moment that really got to you. If you've been replaying a moment in your head, maybe that's it. And notice as you bring that moment back, are you having any somatic markers? Are there any sensations in your body coming up? And if so, just stay with them and breathe. Now, ask yourself, what core emotion seems closest to what you felt in that moment? Could it have been anger, sadness, grief, disgust, maybe something positive even, excitement, joy, sexual excitement. Some of us find those things distressing too. So notice what core emotion seems most connected to that experience that you had. And if it's more than one, pick the one that seems the most potent for yourself to work with. Now let yourself really connect to that emotion and say to yourself, I'm feeling blank, angry, sad, whatever it is, I'm feeling, and notice what that feels like. And then put a hand on your chest and tell yourself, and this can be out loud or in your head, it makes sense that you felt this way. And notice what that feels like. And then just notice those somatic sensations and invite them in, make space for them, stay with them. Don't judge them or try to change them. Just stay with it and notice what you're feeling. And you may or may not have a wave-like experience right now. Either way is okay. Even if it's just a little sensation in your throat, a little tightness comes and goes. Just see what that's like. We're just practicing getting in touch. Take a few more breaths. Go ahead and open your eyes. Come back to this virtual room and back to me. And let's go ahead and have a Q&A. All right, so I'm just give me a moment to get myself organized here. All right, so the first question I'm going to answer, an attendee asked, so for example, with the flooding you discussed before, how do you ride that wave? I think with flooding, it becomes too much and you can't even feel what you're feeling. So that's a really good point. And this is an example with flooding, especially if it feels like it's too much. This is probably an example of you being in what we would call hyperarousal. So it's kind of like a fight or flight experience where your anxiety is really high. So you may be aware that you're feeling sadness or feeling anger or whatever it is. But on top of that, you're also feeling this heightened fight or flight anxiety. And so what I would recommend for this is really spending time grounding the anxiety. So the breathing and the grounding exercises. And something I didn't talk about today is a concept called the window of tolerance. So you may want to look that up, and we will be sending resources after this webinar to everyone that attends. The window of tolerance is a good way to kind of understand what happens when we are like a little too aroused. There's too much going on emotionally, and how we can use kind of grounding and soothing to get us back to a place where we're still in touch with the emotion, but it's not so overwhelming. And typically it's grounding and kind of regulating ourselves so that we are experiencing the emotion, but we're not overwhelmed by it. So I would recommend looking into that, but I would say just from this, what you can get from this webinar, the grounding exercises would really be the place to start. Next question, can you talk about self-validating too much? This is actually something that comes up a lot with self-validation and self-compassion, is that it can feel like you're maybe, being too kind to yourself, right? Like maybe you're being too you're going to let yourself off the hook, or you're going to somehow, become weak, or, I don't know exactly what you're thinking with that. But I hear that a lot from clients, right? Like, I'm afraid if I validate myself too much, or if I'm too self-compassionate, then, it's going to be cheesy, or I'm not going to get things done. But a lot of times people haven't actually tried that out. So I actually don't think you can do this too much. But I think what you may want to do is try to keep it private, right? Like, you don't have to share with everyone, I'm like self-validating myself right now, right? Like, that could be a lot for other people sometimes. But if you're doing this for yourself, like, it makes sense that I'm feeling this way. It makes sense that I'm experiencing this. I understand what I'm going through. Really helps you to stay grounded and deal with things in a good way. So I actually don't think you can do too much of it, but I definitely understand the concern. Okay, another one. In the example you gave of the client who was sad that his father didn't see Black Lives Matter the same way, what if the other person says, yeah, I can't believe you don't see things my way? Doesn't that create standoff where you're left where you started, sad? Maybe. I mean, so the kind of, I think the takeaway for this client of going through that emotional wave was that he got to a place where he felt really differently about the conversation with his dad. He felt like he wanted to share his sadness with his dad. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he can control how his dad's going to respond, right? His dad might hang up on him again. But that's a good instance for him to maybe use that self-validation, self-compassion, and ride that wave of sadness, because we can't control other people ultimately. But what we can do is renegotiate our own internal relationship with our emotions. And I know with this client, being able to kind of get in touch with that sadness that he experienced that was beneath the avoidance and the drinking and the anxiety that he was experiencing around his dad really helped him to feel more grounded in himself. So even if his dad didn't respond well to him sharing that sadness, that doesn't mean that he wasn't himself in a better place for dealing with it. Another one, I thought it was interesting to see disgust on the list of core emotions. What do you make of that? Well, disgust is kind of an important emotion. It keeps us away from things that are bad for us. So, of course, we can be disgusted by rotten food, but people are sometimes disgusted by abusive situations too. People get disgusted by people that treat them badly. So I think this particular emotion, it surprised me when I saw it on the list too. But it is actually kind of helpful for us to think about the ways that disgust can help us to stay safe. And I think abusive relationships is really a place that I think that emotion plays a really important role. And if we're able to kind of get in touch with that disgust, and I've seen this especially with clients who were sexually abused as children, being able to kind of find that feeling of disgust around it can really help them to process that experience and get over a lot of the shame that they felt around it. Next question. What is something that we can do to prepare ourselves when we know that we are going to experience more waves in the foreseeable future from the potential tough times to come? We know that there are positive things coming out of the confusing and perplexing time during the COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement, but in this election year, we also know that there would be more difficult moments to come. So, I think this is a great question, because it's not like we ever just process all our emotions and then we're done, right? Like, we're definitely going to have more challenging experiences in the future, and we're going to have to ride more emotional waves. And I think what you're talking about maybe thinking about these difficult things to come, to me, that sounds like anxiety. That sounds like you might be kind of up in that part of that corner of the triangle, right? Kind of thinking about the future and feeling anxious about it. And so I would kind of say there's a couple things you can do. One is trying to get in touch with any core emotions you might be feeling right now. So maybe with the election year and all that's going on with COVID-19 and the protests and the police brutality and all these things, are you feeling sadness? Are you feeling grief? Are you feeling anger? Can you get in touch with those emotions right now? And if you can, and make some space for them, you might be able to find that place of calm on the other side of the wave. And just being prepared that, in a year where a lot of difficult moments are coming up, either in your personal life or, collectively in our country and our world, if there's a lot going on, it's a good time to get, first of all, a good self-care routine down, and also to make space for this. So something you could add to your self-care routine is making appointments with your emotions. Of course, you can do this with a therapist, but you can also do it yourself. And I often recommend this to clients, like, hey, if you're having a tough week, if something's going on, make a little bit of time every day to get in touch with your core emotions. And when you do that, you can kind of also, in a way, help to contain the emotion in other times. So if you're experiencing a lot of grief, for example, being able to say, I've got an appointment with my grief at noon, can help it to not take over and flood you in other times when it's present. So those are my recommendations for that. What do we do when somatic markers are not always visible? So I'm guessing for this question, just kind of like you're not really sure what somatic markers are coming with your emotions. Grounding can be a good way to kind of maybe, again, get out of the anxiety and begin to notice what's happening in your body. But it's okay. Some people are less connected to their bodies or just experience less somatic markers, and that's okay. Maybe for you, it's more in your mind. It's more of a cognitive experience. So you could say to yourself something like, okay, can I get in touch with sadness, right? Am I sad about something? Maybe I'm not feeling anything in my body, but as kind of hard as it sounds, maybe even thinking about the thing that makes you the saddest, right? So if something in your life is happening that's really sad and you've created an appointment with your emotions, thinking about the worst part of it, like, I'm really sad about this breakup I'm going through. Inviting in the thoughts can sometimes be an entryway too. So our bodies, our somatic markers, are not the only way into our core emotions. It can also be our thoughts. So that would be one recommendation. How do you work with others who experience difficulty coming back to their emotion after distracting themselves? Well, this happens a lot. I think a lot of people can have difficulty connecting to their emotions. So sometimes, there's like an avoidance there, right? It can feel really like I'm distracting myself for a reason, right? I don't want to go into that emotional place. Or, even kind of that block you're experiencing could be a little bit of a defense against going into that emotion too. So one thing I would recommend is kind of thinking, can I experience in even like 5% of this emotion? Just a little bit of it. Like, if I could imagine the emotion takes up this much space, can I experience this much of it? Just let myself get in touch with a little bit of it. Sometimes reducing it, like slicing it thinner in that way, can be a good way to get in touch with the emotion if you're having trouble kind of getting through a block, or if you're distracting yourself and not wanting to get into it for some reason. I struggle with validating my feelings during interpersonal conflicts. I feel guilty for not validating my loved one, and I get sort of stuck where either I don't give any ground or give it all, and I don't really feel like I make any progress. Any tips for validating yourself, but it not being it at the expense of someone else validating themselves, if that makes any sense? It makes a lot of sense, right? And what I'm hearing here is kind of a like standoff again, that kind of like all or nothing moment of like either I win or you win. And the thing about that is that's sort of a defensive place, right? Feeling like either I'm right or you're right, right? There's not space for us both to be right. So what I would really focus on is validating your emotion, not your stance, right? So your stance might be, you never wash the dishes. And they might be like, I wash the dishes sometimes, right? Like that could be an example, right? And so you're not validating like the thought, like, or the stance or the belief that you're having that they don't wash the dishes. You validate the anger. I'm feeling angry about this. And riding these emotional waves, validating your own emotions, all this does not mean that you're going to be able to like perfectly work out an interpersonal conflict. It's just not how it works, unfortunately. But it can help you to get to, again, that more grounded place. If you're able to validate your emotions, experience your emotional waves, and this is probably something you might want to do separate from the person that you're having that conflict with. But if you're able to take that space, validate, ride that wave, you might be able to get to that more grounded place, what we call the open-hearted state, which was again at the bottom of that triangle, where you might be a little bit more open to hearing what the other person has to say and a little bit more grounded in sharing what you're experiencing. You might have a more productive conversation. Next question. Do you think waves dissipate in intensity over time? If you are experiencing something core to your identity, do you think with practice the feelings become less intense? Well, it kind of depends. So, if you're trying to process something really big, right? Like for example, if you had like some sort of trauma in your life and you're wanting to process that experience, there's going to be a lot of emotion there, right? And so, you might be experiencing a lot. And this is why it's really important to get help sometimes. Something like therapy around trauma can really help you to work through those emotions, because there might be a lot of them, right? But that said, I do think for a lot of people, eventually, if you are able to work through your core emotions about something that happened to you that feels very core to your identity, that eventually you will kind of get to a more grounded place around it, and it won't be so triggering. I mean, that's what trauma therapy is all about. And I don't know, based on your question, that you're necessarily talking about trauma, but the same concept applies for kind of anything that's really distressing for us in our emotional lives. If we're able to kind of process those feelings, right? The emotions, the core emotions are like energy in our body. It can really transform things. So we, just like I expressed with grief earlier, if you're able to kind of move through that grief, you can kind of get to the other side of it, and you see the loss differently. You come to terms with it. So I think the same thing can apply here as well. What tips do you have for self-care on a daily basis? Great question. Well, I don't mean to sound like your primary care doctor, but I think some really important like daily practices, right, are eating well, drinking water, sleeping enough. Those things I think are all forms of self-care and are all really important to keep yourself kind of balanced. But it really depends on who you are beyond that. Exercise, of course, is also important. I'll just share for myself, because for me, I tend to hold a lot of tension in my body. I tend to go more to an anxious place, and I find myself holding a lot of tension in my body. So if I'm stressed out or there's a lot of things going on emotionally in my life, I feel it in my body. So for me, like I said, a hot bath soothes my muscles, helps me to release some of that tension. Another thing is stretching. So yoga or just kind of stretching my muscles can really help me to feel relaxed. And sometimes I like to even invite in the more core emotional things into my bath or my yoga practice. And it's amazing how transformative that can be. So if I'm angry about something and I think about it while I'm stretching, a lot of times it can really help me to move through it in a way that I didn't otherwise. But yeah, as far as self-care, I think really think of the things that restore you, right? Like think of when you're feeling really depleted, right? And you feel like your energy is just kind of tapped out. What usually helps you to feel better? It's different for different people, but whatever those things are, that's your self-care. Next question. I would sometimes find myself feeling frustrated or afraid. Would you consider them core emotions? Why or why not? Yes and no. So, I mean, it kind of depends on the situation, but frustration is often a form of anger. So when we're feeling frustrated, a lot of times it's a version of feeling angry. And so if you notice that you're feeling frustrated, you might want to find out like, can I find like an anger feeling here? And can I make space for that? And how do I feel that in my body? How do I experience that? And let yourself go through that. As far as being afraid, fear tends to be kind of an anxiety type of response. So it kind of depends on what you're afraid about. But with that, I would say, work more on soothing yourself and grounding and trying to figure out if maybe there's something else underneath that feeling, like it might be sadness or it might be anger or whatever it might be. See if you notice that there's anything else underneath that fear. Because a lot of times fear is more of a fight or flight thing where we're kind of kicked up into our anxious place. And we might need to actually do the more grounding things to kind of bring ourselves back down. Again, you can look into the window of tolerance for this, but back to a place where we can kind of experience our emotions in a way that feels good. And it looks like this is the last question, unless someone else sends one in. Do you have any specific breathing exercises or patterns that you recommend? Yes, I do. So one is breathing through your nose really deeply and making sure that your exhale is longer than your inhale. This is actually a signal to our nervous system that we're safe, because when we're unsafe, we tend to be more like kind of panting. It's a way to kind of get oxygen into our muscles in case we need to run or protect ourselves or fight. So if you're feeling kind of anxious or you're feeling keyed up in some way, taking a deep breath in through your nose and then out, but making the exhale longer, is a signal to your nervous system that you're safe. Another one I like is called square breathing. With that one, you count to 4 and there's like 4 sides to the square. So the first is you're counting to 4 inhaling, and then you're counting to 4 holding, counting to 4 exhaling, and then counting to 4 holding with the breath out. So I'll give an example. And then you would inhale again. So that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Those are all the questions we had. And a little bit more about the practice, My Therapy NYC, where I work. We are a group private practice, and there are a lot of very talented therapists that work there. I often, when we're all together in a staff meeting or something, I look around and I think to myself, I would love to have any of these people as my therapists. So I highly recommend checking out our services. We do individual and couples therapy. We also have some groups, some therapy groups, including a gay men's group that I facilitate. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out. We also have lots of resources on our website. including a bunch of free mental health related blogs and video blogs and other webinars like this one. We have a bunch of other webinars that you can check out. So if you enjoyed this experience, you can visit our website and find more. And if you're not already on our email list, I recommend joining. That's a great way to keep up with all of these resources that we put out. So thank you so much for joining. If you join today, you'll get a recording of the webinar so you can watch again. You'll also get a list of resources related to this webinar. So if you want to learn more, I put together a list of things that I think can be helpful for you for feeling your feelings. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can use our handle, MyTherapyNYC, or the hashtag MyTherapyChat to continue the conversation. Now go out there and feel your feelings. Thank you so much again for joining. It's been a great time, and I hope you all enjoyed yourself. So thanks again.